Our topic is meeting is being recorded.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. There we go. The topic for these three Thursday mornings that I'm with you for this particular purpose is what I call either the danger or the heresy of Christian nationalism. And last week I tried to sketch out what the meaning of that term and definitions and what are the issues and problems. Basically, if we want to sum it up, Christian nationalism has to do with the alignment of power and the alignment of ideology between state and the Christian faith or the Christian church. Okay? And that's a long-standing historical phenomenon. That's what we're going to look at today, what I call Christian nationalism in historical perspective, and its really tragic consequences across 2 millennia. The reason why I think the historical overview is so important is we belong to larger realities. We are not isolated automatons. We are influenced by our history. We're influenced by our family stories. We're influenced by our ethnic and racial and national stories. Sig and I were born and raised in Germany during the tail end of the Nazi era, and then came to America as immigrants. There are things in that circle of experiences that impact our individual, relational, communal DNA. Okay. I have friends, Carol and Peter Schreck, some of you know them. They were members of this church for a long time. They're now out in Lancaster, who were therapists, and their central orienting system in therapy was family systems. That when people go to counseling or they need somebody to help them think through their issues and the problems that they're dealing with, family systems always says, this is part of a larger whole. You need to look at the system in order to know what's, you know that. And so, Christian nationalism in the historical perspective. It begins very early in the history of Christianity. I mentioned that last time. The Roman Emperor Constantine in 323 declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Some religious scholars and historians have said the worst thing that ever happened to Christianity was Constantine. Now, there were benefits, of course. Christians stopped to be persecuted. They've been going through persecution for 2 centuries, practically. And that stopped. But at the same time, that began the alignment of power, the issue of power and control, of impact and influence in the world, and empire and the Christian church became wedded. And whenever that happens throughout history, Christianity loses much of its impact, its uniqueness, its contribution that it is called to make to the world. Jesus told his disciples, I'm sending you out in the world as salt and light. Next Thursday, I'm going to deal with biblical perspectives. That is, how is this phenomenon, Christian nationalism, how do we see that from a perspective of the foundational thrust of the biblical witness about what God is about, what God wants to be about in human life and human community. Okay? So, the result of Constantine's decision was that from that point forward, through the medieval period, It's approximately 500 to 1500. The first part of that is sometimes called by historians the Dark Ages and then the Middle Ages, until we get to the Renaissance in the 16th century, which the renewal of learning and so on. From that point forward, through the medieval period and beyond, Christian leaders, bishops, popes, archbishops, priests, began to play in the big leagues. The big leagues often orchestrating and determining the fate of communities, of tribes, even of nations. Think later on the Holy Roman Empire, which was everything but holy. The alignment of Christian faith with state authority. The most overt manifestations of Christian nationalism and white supremacy. And as I mentioned last time, white supremacy is a close cousin and has often influenced Christian nationalistic ideology. I think I'm going to highlight certain periods and certain movements in history that are part of that long inheritance that is part of the presence of Christianity in this world, particularly in the Western world. The Crusades, you've all known about that. Of course, the word crusade comes from the Spanish and Latin word crux and cruz, which really refers to the cross.
So just a question in terms of timing. Yes. Do you view the Crusades as offensive or defensive?
Offensive.
Okay, so the Muslim conquest, as the Muslim conquest moved east?
Moved west.
I'm sorry, no, they
moved
west.
Yeah.
The Muslim conquest moved west.
Yeah. But when we get to the Crusades, of course, Islam had been around now for 400 years approximately.
Yeah.
Because Muhammad 600 and something.
622.
But there you see it on the screen. The military campaigns, religious wars, were authorized by popes, led by kings and princes and lords across European kingdoms and empires. Urban II, in a sermon at the Council of Clermont, called, and that was in 1095, called for Christians to unite, to recapture Jerusalem and the Holy Land and other formerly Christian lands in the Middle East, which was then called the Levant. The eastern countries that bordered the Eastern Mediterranean, basically, that whole, what we now call the Middle East. To recover those from the Muslims, okay? So it became there were religious campaigns, religious wars. The papal cry was Deus vult, God wills it. That was the height of that sermon. That became the popular motivation, motivated thousands to volunteer as crusaders, to join the military forces that were raised by kings and lords and emperors throughout Western European nations.
It's like the modern,
Pardon?
it's like the modern slogan, Uncle Sam wants you.
Yeah, that's right.
On the posters, Uncle Sam wants you. That inspired me, by the way. Way, long time ago. I mean, I followed the call.
The slaughter of.
Can I ask a question before we change slides? I don't want to interrupt you. Are you about to change slides or are you still going on this slide?
Still on this one.
All right, when you're done, let me ask a question. Good.
Okay. The slaughter of Muslims, Jews, and soldiers is estimated to have about 1.8 million. There were 3 major crusades and several smaller ones. And as the Crusaders moved toward the Levant, toward the Middle East, they pillaged and slaughtered not only Jews and Muslims, but other Christians who stood in the way, who did not want to participate. There were terrible religious wars. So there you have the first large manifestation of the alignment between state power and religious power. That's the popes and the archbishops and bishops throughout the Christian Western world were aligned with state power, kings, landlords, princes, emperors, to take up the cry. God wills it, God wants us to take this back, and so we use what? Power. Okay. This.
So Manfred,
Yes.
at that time, 1.8 million people was a huge, much bigger percentage of the people in the world than, we hear 1.8 million and it doesn't mean that much to us.
Right.
But at that time, 1.8 million was an awful lot of people.
It was huge. Yeah, whole communities got wiped out.
So question for you, when you said nationalism on the prior slide, is that nationalism like we talk about the Catholic Christianity, like the encompassing Catholic versus the Catholic denomination? Because clearly it wasn't a national event, or it's a multinational event. The Crusades, right? It wasn't like just England decided to do this.
No,
Right, so it's
France,
nationalism in the big sense.
France, England, Spain,
Right.
Portugal, Germany, or the Germanic states,
Right.
they were all part of this. Yeah, it was a larger cooperation.
So it wasn't one nation, and so it's nationalism in the big
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah,
And then you put white supremacy on there, but they didn't attack Africa. I mean, attacking Africa could have been white supremacy too, right? They were taking back the Holy Land. So I don't think anybody was saying, let's go kill the people who are different colors. They were saying, let's go take it back for Christianity.
at that point, they were basically religious wars.
Yeah.
So where you have the alignment between church power and state power.
Right.
Yeah.
So Manfred, just because the Roman Empire was the Constantinople and Rome, so this was driven by Rome or Constantinople?
This was driven by the Western Church.
Okay.
Yeah, at this point, the Eastern and Western Church had already split.
Okay.
In fact, it was split under Constantine during his time. Constantine, that's why you have Constantinople, established, wanted the empire to be controlled by there. And then there were two emperors, one in Rome and one in Constantinople.
Orthodox and Holy Roman. Yeah.
Pardon?
He said Orthodox and Holy Roman.
Right. And of course, Holy Roman Empire, these European states, many of them were part of the Holy Roman Empire, which was very much the secular powers, kings and lords, were very much under the thumb of whom? The Pope. State, religious power and state power were aligned. Sometimes they were in conflict, sometimes they cooperated, but there was this alignment in one way or another. Tim?
I'm not sure if this was a narrow period of time or a larger period of time, but I've always thought that kings had to be blessed by the Pope, and then the kings and the state kind of reinforced the laws that kept the church and the Pope in authority. So it really was, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine kind of.
Yeah, and of course, at that point, you basically had the Latin church in the West. Protestantism didn't happen until the 15th century, 16th century. And so the big popes and bishops and priests had power over state figures because they could refuse to let them into communion, the Eucharist. All kinds of ways in which they exercise power over the state. And then the state exercised power over the church by economic means, granting land, etc., etc. So there was this unholy alliance. You know this, the Crusader shield, cross and sword, go hand in hand. That is probably the most obvious symbol of the alignment of power. And power often involves physical violence as the sword, the shield, defense and aggression and defense. And the word crusade has come to be known and defined as an expedition marked with or bearing the sign of the cross. Of course, you know, now we talk about political crusades and all kinds of things. It doesn't mean that anymore. It's become a common term for any kind of vigorous campaign. Okay.
Manfred, if I could,
Yes.
you also have the Knights Templar, which was an army for the Pope. And the other thing is, with the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, they put a mosque on top of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And I think that was one of the rallying cries to take Jerusalem back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And also the church in Constantinople, they made it into a mosque.
Still is. And of course, the interesting thing is that Jerusalem was what? Historically a Jewish city, right? The Jews had been driven out of Jerusalem by the Romans during the Jewish-Roman War in 70 AD. And so not only the Muslims, but the Jews who had returned to Palestine and to Jerusalem were the objects of slaughter by the Christian forces coming from the West.
Of course, today half the people believe that the Muslims were there first.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Another example of the alignment of state power with Christian power was European colonialism from the 15th century onward for several centuries. Columbus returned from his first expedition to America to the Americas, primarily the Caribbean and the South America, to a hero's welcome in Spain, bringing with him gold, brightly colored parrots, and a dozen captive indigenous people. Okay. This is what's there. This is what we can bring back from the New World. It wasn't recognized that it was not a new world to the indigenous people. No? The whole theory of discovery, and we'll talk about that.
So were there any European colonialisms that were southern focused in terms of Africa? So did that predate?
Yes, later.
Later, okay.
That was the expansion.
Okay.
The first part was finding a route to India.
Right.
Okay, so that was going west.
It was replacing.
And then gradually, especially the Portuguese went down into Africa, and then the other European countries followed, like the Dutch and the Spanish, the English, and even the Germans.
Yeah, the reason for the search for the route to India was that the Silk Road had been closed by the Muslims.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So, as somebody has said, that's why it's in quotation marks, the return of Columbus precipitated one of the most fateful theological developments in the history of the Western Christian Church, the creation of the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was established in a series of 15th century papal bulls. Papal bulls, bull was a Latin term that referred to seal, a lead seal that was placed on the document, which gave it its gravitas, you know, from the Holy Roman Empire.
So was a papal bull part of the papal infallibility?
Oh yeah.
So a bull was basically the Pope certifying this.
The Pope said
this
he
is the word
is
of
in
God.
the person of Christ.
And so
Yeah.
this
So
is,
it was authoritative.
Yeah.
It was a public decree or a charter.
Okay.
So there were these papal bulls, and the doctrine that was proclaimed in those bulls was claimed that European civilization and Western Christianity are superior to all other cultures, races, and religions. And that's where white supremacy begins to raise its head, okay? The doctrine merged the interests of European imperialism, including the African slave trade, with Christian missionary zeal. The interesting thing is that Christian missionaries often moved with political, economic power that invaded these countries and claimed the wealth of these nations for themselves. Now, there were wonderful Christians whose only missionaries, whose only purpose was to evangelize the natives. But I don't know whether how many of you remember the movie The Mission, which was about Christian influence in South America. It's a wonderful movie. Obviously, it's a story. It's fiction, but it's historical fiction. And there you have a picture of the alignment of state power with Christian missionary power, and the economic interests of the Spanish Empire operating in what is now South America. The church had amazing power over the political leaders, the conquistadors, the explorers, but the other way around worked also, that the state had power over the Christian missionaries and sometimes dictated where they could be and where they could not be.
Manfred, was there ever, did any of the charters specifically mention the slave trade? Did any pope specifically bless that? Or was it all kind of implied?
You know, I'm not sure about that.
Because I know people use the story of Jacob and Esau to say, you know, like, justify Esau and justify the slave trade. And
Oh yeah, that certainly comes along. Once the slave trade gets moving, and that is when Africa especially becomes the focus of European nations colonizing the entire African continent.
The curse of Ham.
Yeah, and I'll get to that. The whole question of the curse of Ham.
But as far as you know, there's nothing that any popes didn't specifically bless it.
No, only in the sense that this doctrine of discovery, that white Christianity, white Christians were both religiously and ethnically, racially superior.
And that meant.
And out of that gradually emerged the idea, and then biblical texts were taken out of historical context and used as a foundation. And I'll have a few quotes here.
What that meant was that they could, that even though indigenous people lived on the land, based on the doctrine of discovery, if white European explorers came upon that land, they had the right to take that land from the indigenous people because of their superiority.
And when we talk about white Europeans at this point in time, we're also talking about people from Spain or Portugal. Are they white at this point?
Oh yeah. Spain and Portugal, that's white.
They speak Spanish, but they're white.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, because everything intermingled a lot. I mean, all the trade through the Mediterranean.
Basically, Western Europe. And then, of course, you have the Asiatic tribes from the Caucasus on east.
So, Scott, what was that word you said earlier, that Manfred said that's what it is?
The curse of Ham, he said he's gonna get to.
Okay, curse of Ham.
Yeah. Okay, the doctrine of discovery, undergirded by these papal bulls, decrees and charters, that claimed that European civilization, Western Christianity was superior to all other cultures, races, or ethnic groups, and religions. The doctrine merged the interests of European imperialism, which was basically power and wealth, including the African slave trade, with Christian missionary zeal. And there you had sometimes not conscious, but you had the real kind of parallelism, walking hand in hand. Christian missionaries were able to go to these places once they were taken over and the power of the European nations was exercised. Okay, another historical high point, I think. These are pieces along the way. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1646. Emperor Ferdinand II of the Holy Roman Empire was a passionate Catholic. In alliance with Rome, sought to force Catholicism on the Protestant states, regions throughout the empire. You're talking now the 1600s, when the Reformation had begun to make its impact. And there were princes throughout the Holy Roman Empire and on the edges around the Holy Roman Empire who were Protestants. And so the states were Protestant. That's the beginning of what became known in Europe as the state church. The state collected the taxes to support the church economically and so on. Sought to force Catholicism on the Protestant states, regions throughout the empire. Other European states, England and Sweden, who had become primarily what? Protestant.
Yeah.
The Anglican Church was in a sense Catholic in all but name. It was basically founded by Henry VIII in the 16th century because he didn't get an annulment of his marriage to Anne Boleyn.
Right.
And Anne Boleyn, yeah, I think that was her. And so he said, heck with Rome, and he became what? The head of the Church of England. Now there's the most clear example of the unity, the uniting between power of church and state. Okay.
Manfred, also at this time you had the Spanish Inquisition, where the Catholic Church, with the permission and of the King of Spain, ruled terribly.
You had, especially in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, you had this very close alignment between state and religious power. Up to 8 million soldiers and civilians died as a result of battles, famine, and disease, which were brought about by the religious. There were religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, basically. Some areas of what is now modern Germany experienced population declines of over 50%.
Back and forth.
Now, some of that was bubonic plague, but a lot of that was engineered, as it were, by the constant warfare and battles, dislocated people and drove them out of their homes, and the destruction that was going on.
50%, you're not just talking about soldiers. Instead of 50%, you're not just talking about soldiers.
You're talking about a lot of civilians. Yeah. Because a lot of these medieval armies, they plundered villages because that's how they sustained themselves on their marches against the enemy. And they plundered the food of the natives.
As far along as the Civil War in this country.
That's right.
That's how they lived out. I wanted to say too that an interesting fact is that the further an empire or a state, it's a principality, as small as it could get or as large, the further away from Rome, the more Protestant it became. Because today, it was Austria, Bavaria, and in the southern states of Germany are still Catholic.
The most Catholic.
Stock Catholic, we say, stark Catholic. I mean, there's.
We grew up in Bavaria, and the Catholic Church, that was it. Protestants were the minority. Yeah. So
Manfred, can I ask you just real quick on this? It feels to me like we're moving beyond a desire to convert and proselytize and share our faith to just an outward power grab that was shielded by, or in league with, the powerful folks in Rome. But this really wasn't, like we were talking before, about missionaries who are really going out and trying to share the word of Christ and the love of Christ with people that, didn't know, right? this wasn't really about Catholicism. This was about pure power and authority, or was it?
Yeah. Well,
It was both.
And I think it was.
It was both.
You know, it just struck me that it was the church, quote unquote, that enslaved peoples, but yet William Wilberforce, an evangelical, was one of the key people to get the slave trade stopped. So it was the evangelical church that came out and said, no, this is wrong.
yeah, that's right. There were those forces, of course, that did not align themselves with state power, but challenged it. Okay, another amazing example, I think, of this white nationalism and Christian nationalism and white supremacy. The Boer migrations to and dominance in Southern Africa from 1659 all the way to the end of the 20th century. By mostly the Dutch with some Huguenots and Germans. Boer, by the way, is the Afrikaans or the Dutch word for power, which is farmers. They were basically farmers that migrated to Southern Africa. By mostly the Dutch, some Huguenots, which were French Protestants. And when I lived in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, there was in Charleston, a Huguenot church.
Yeah.
There's still a Huguenot church.
There was a huge Huguenot slaughter in France.
Yeah,
Which drove.
that's right. And so many of them then immigrated, religious persecution. Okay, tracks across various regions in Southern Africa, Transvaal, the Cape region, forceful conquest of tribal lands, the establishment of Boer settlements and states, the Boer Wars against the British and creation of white-dominated states and townships, and the final aftermath of that beginning in the 17th century, 1600s, was the terrible system of apartheid. Religious and theological foundations for the Boer migration and the Boer dominance in Southern Africa were religious theological foundations. The Boer migrants believed themselves to be the elect of God, based on a strict reading of the Calvinist Reformed theology of election. Okay. We are the elect people of God, chosen by God as a new covenant people. This is all language that's part of the Boer reality. They believed that they were under divine mandate to conquer the new promised land. See the language there. Southern Africa, echoing Israel's conquest of Canaan, to subdue the native populations, to establish the true faith as the dominant controlling religious faith, to order, control, and segregate the various racial groups in keeping with God's design. That there were ways in which early chapters in the book of Genesis, for example, were being read that said God has established these different racial and ethnic groups, and some are superior to others. That's God's hierarchical order. Okay?
So question for you, so these are farmers, right?
Farmers.
So once they established their Boer homeland and started farming there, did they continue to expand, or did they just farm the land that they had?
They continued to expand, and more Boers, farmers immigrated from Holland. And
so they kept spreading out, trying to take over more land in Africa.
Gained more land and had fought wars against native tribes and conquered their territory. Okay. Here's a citation from an Afrikaner. Afrikaner, by the way, is what they call themselves. Africans, but Afrikaner, that's basically the Dutch Reformed Calvinists, which was the dominant religious reality among the Boer. Here's a quote: South Africa, but from a sermon. South Africa must always be a place of white supremacy. We shall assume fatherly responsibility for the Kafirs, that was their term for Native Africans, who will never be able to govern themselves. We must rule them, for they are children, and we must tell them what to do. Yeah.
Very.
Scary, yeah.
And today, what you have with the ANC in charge of South Africa is the natives kicking the white farmers out brutally, killing them with machetes, the old tire necklace around the head, setting it on fire. And it's a war today because of what went on 500 years ago.
Because of, yeah, the seeds that were sown by that reality. When the British abolished slavery in 1834, Frank, you referred to that, under Wilberforce, that was, 30 years before the abolishment of slavery in the United States, and demanded that the Boers who settled in British territory in South Africa free their African servants, is what they call them. The Boers violently opposed it, and that began the Boer Wars against the British. Okay? They believed, like many others of European descent, that God had established a hierarchy of racial groups. White Christians were considered superior to people of indigenous races. The Boer Wars lasted, the big ones from 1899 to 1902. The Boer opposition to the British abolition of slavery led to the British fighting a bitter colonial war against the Boers in Southern Africa, achieving ultimate victory. That is, the British won the wars ultimately. But the Boer were so prominent and so powerful that they gradually gravitated into significant political power positions and shaped the structures, the cultural, religious, political structures. The Afrikaner, the descendants of the original Boer settlers, gained strategic political positions within the British government, colonial government. They played a key role in the development of apartheid.
So there's apartheid started in the 20th century?
Pardon?
So apartheid really started in the 20th
It
century?
really started
After the English beat the...
after the British wars, yeah. And lasted for almost a century, that system. They played a key role in the development of apartheid. And of course, apartheid simply is, that's the African word for apartness. Okay?
And was there some kind of reason or justification that England gave to move into South Africa? I mean, I'm assuming it wasn't, we're going to throw off the Dutch colonialists.
Oh, no, no.
And return the land to the
It was
African
part
people.
of British colonialism.
Yeah, right.
They occupied territory on the Cape, Transvaal,
Yeah.
the southern portion of.
There was income coming from South Africa back to the crown.
Right,
And the Cape of
Right,
Good Hope
and-
was traded.
Right.
and it was economic power, political power, control.
What was it about Cape?
The Cape of Good Hope was where the bottom tip of Africa was where all the shipping was.
Yeah.
So you control the Cape of Good Hope, you control shipping.
At that
Right.
point, England's a naval power and they wanted to control the main ports on the trade routes.
But at the same time, there was a competition among the other European states for establishing colonies in Africa to control the wealth that comes out of it.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
There's a huge amount of.
And basically that wealth is gold and diamonds.
And that were, yeah.
So you had the Portuguese and you had the Belgians and you had other countries that claimed different parts of Africa so they could control the wealth that that particular part of Africa.
Manfred, you got about another 10 minutes.
And the British ruled that with an iron thumb. They were the people that instituted concentration camps, and hundreds of thousands of Boers died, starved.
England taught Hitler.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. There were terrible consequences of those wars. But once those wars were over and there was obviously strong Boer influence in the new government that was developed. The Afrikaans word meaning separating or setting apart, founded on the idea of separating people based on racial or ethnic criteria, on the Boer administration, and a lot of that happened legally, that is within this British Empire colony, the Dutch really gained cultural prominence. And a lot of the laws that controlled the apartheid system were in fact formulated by leading Boers who gained positions of power. So under Boer, this ideology resulted in strict enforced and inhuman segregation and oppressive restrictions upon all non-whites, but especially millions of blacks who were forcefully removed from their homes, confined and restricted to tribal homelands, which the government designated. And in most cases, they were places that these Africans had never seen. They were not their homelands. They had been removed from their homelands.
It's like the movement of Indians.
Yeah, reservations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Reservations, yeah.
Getting to that.
Oh, sorry.
But this is, I mean, this is in some sense, this is a preview or parallel to what happened in the American colonies and beyond. Blacks were not allowed to vote, to engage in any political activity, to socialize with other races. Interracial marriage was strictly forbidden and severely punished. Blacks were reduced to labor for the whites in mostly low-paying servant jobs. They were designated as the servant class. Okay. Another example, the transcontinental slave trade of millions of Africans. First to the Caribbean, then the 13 colonies, and the subsequent United States during the 16th to 19th centuries, probably among the most inhuman manifestation of the ideology of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and its alliance with state power. This supremacy ideology was undergirded by the use of biblical texts, twisted out of their original context and meaning, and applied to justify the institution of slavery. And that was very prominent during that tragic period in the early century and a half of our own nation. Citations like the following from Christian leaders, pastors, and denomination leaders were commonplace. Negro slavery is an institution of heaven. See this? Is an institution from heaven for the mutual benefit of master and slave, as proved by the Bible. God himself authorized Noah to doom the posterity of Ham. From Ham were descended the nations that occupied the land of Canaan and those that now constitute the African or Negro race. There's absolutely no historical, cultural evidence that there's any connection at all between the descendants of Ham through Canaan. And the interesting thing is, Ham is never cursed. It's Canaan, son of Ham, who is cursed, who was a participant in the revealing of the father's nakedness, which was the core story there. From Ham were descended the nations that occupied the land of Canaan. Their inheritance, according to prophecy, has been and will continue to be slavery. As long as we have the Bible, we expect to maintain it. These are two examples of hundreds of statements and sermons that were preached by pastors of congregations, by leaders of theological schools, colleges and seminaries, that perpetuated this ideology of white superiority over blacks.
Was Ham African American or African?
No, that's the thing. There were some people did this false exegetical work to connect the word ham to the Hebrew word black. Scholarship has shown there's absolutely no connection. Ham never meant black. And how Ham, the son of a white Israelite or pre-Israelite, I mean, they were not, Noah and his sons were not Israelites. They don't start until Abraham, a few centuries later. That there's any connection between that and the black-skinned people in the African continent. Absolutely no evidence for any of this. It was the use of isolated biblical texts that were put together in a doctrinal scheme as a foundation, as a justification for this racist ideology.
So Ham from the Middle East all of a sudden became an African. So Ham from the Middle East all of a sudden became an
All
African.
of a sudden, yeah.
But
But
basically,
everybody else
they,
in the Middle East wasn't
they,
either. Nobody from the Middle East was like,
Iraqis,
Right.
because they came from the Iraq area, so.
Yeah.
pretty much nobody was white, were they? I mean, we're talking about the Middle East.
In the Middle
There
East.
weren't any white people involved.
Okay.
Right.
Well, one or two more examples, and then we have to quit for today, and we'll finish that and then go into the biblical critique of all of this kind of ideology. The westward expansion of the US, driven by the ideology of manifest destiny, undergirded by the belief that the USA was destined, that's the manifest destiny, it's obvious, okay, by God, so its advocates believed, to expand its domain across the continent, to conquer and prosper, subdue and Christianize the natives. The doctrine of discovery laid the foundation for this European political and religious worldview, which we have, that was our inheritance from European Christianity and this alignment of church power with state power. Manifest destiny became the justification for the forced removal of indigenous Americans from their homes into relatively barren territory in the West. You've heard the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee Nation from its lands east of the Mississippi to present-day Oklahoma is but one example of that. My wife had some Cherokee heritage, and there was a story that was told down through the generations how the Cherokees had been divested of their land and driven the Trail of Tears. Thousands of them died along the way. And Native Americans were perceived to be inferior by the white settlers and pioneers of the waves of immigrants from mostly white Europe. The belief that it was the will of God that they tame the wilderness and civilize the West further up opened the gates for the huge expansion of the slave trade and the resulting economic prosperity. That was a result of that. Another example, the perpetuation of white supremacy and Christian nationalism. The emancipation of slaves in 1863 was followed by decades of Jim Crow laws, which continued the subjugation of Black Americans through restrictive and discriminatory laws, demeaning social, economic, and cultural structures. The whole ideology of separate but equal, which is separate but not equal. This perpetuation of white supremacy and nationalism was desired, advocated, and supported by large sectors of the Christian population, especially in the so-called Bible Belt throughout the South and Midwest. All of this was based on the belief that Blacks were essentially inferior and needed to be kept in their place, namely as a servant class.
So was this not just blacks, but also the indigenous people and the Hispanics coming up from the South?
Yeah.
And probably Asians from the West.
And, well, that was the China.
The Chinese Exclusion Act.
Chinese Exclusion Act.
Right.
In terms of, people coming in.
Historically, white European heritage was considered to be the most superior. It goes all the way back to Pope Urban in the 9th century. who published these in the 15th century, these paper bulls about this superiority. Selected biblical texts that call for obedience to and support of state governments. But no, I'm number 8. The German Christians during the Nazi era is, I think, an amazing, much more contemporary example of Christian nationalism. The majority of German Christians and their leaders supported and lauded Hitler and his National Socialist Party and their programs. This was on the basis of selected biblical texts that call for obedience to and support of state authorities. There's a quote from one of the German Lutheran pastors during that period, said, "The state of Hitler calls for the church, and the church must obey his call."
It's totalitarianism.
Pardon?
It was totalitarianism.
Totalitarian and
Top down.
the subjugation of the spirit of the church under the state. So that Hitler
Manfred,
would be, yes.
You also have pastors like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who thumbed their nose at that, saying that was wrong. And he personally paid a hard price.
Yeah, right, exactly. There was opposition, and there came more and more opposition. But this support was based on these texts in Scripture: obey the authorities, Paul in Romans chapter 13, and so on. Deep-seated cultural anti-Semitism, not only in Germany but in the Western world. In America, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Deep-seated cultural anti-Semitism, the belief in a hierarchy of races with Aryans at the top and Jews, Gypsies, and dark-skinned people at the bottom. Martin Niemöller, one of the German pastors, who in the early 30s supported the rise of Hitler and the National Socialists, gradually, as one scholar said, had his own Damascus Road experience, a conversion experience, and was one of the leaders of the confessing church movement, and ultimately ended up in a concentration camp. But after that, he wrote this poem. Some of you probably heard it. First, they came for the socialists, and I was not a socialist and didn't speak up. Then they came for the communists, and I was not a communist, so I remained silent. Then they came for the Jews, and I was not a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I was not a trade unionist, so I remained silent. Then they came for me, and I had no one else to speak for me.
Yeah.
That's the
Yep.
deterioration.
We need to wrap up.
Yeah, we need to wrap up. Okay.
Can be pushed off.
The next two slides are about the opposition to German Christian nationalism by the confessing church movement, by people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, Karl Barth, the great Swiss theologian who was teaching in German university, and many others. And of course, Bonhoeffer was hanged by the Nazis in one of the concentration camps. Martin Niemöller survived and became a forceful witness to what had gone wrong in Germany. Anyway, these are examples across the course of history that are part of our DNA, as it were, that keeps teasing people in that direction. And some of the Protestant, American Protestant white evangelical movements have aligned themselves with political power over the last 20, 30, 40 years, more and more. And there's also a movement opposed to that. So you have, I'm sending you a bibliography of major titles and both essays and books that deal with this topic, the development and what the dangers are and so on and so forth. But I'll kind of pull this together next time at the beginning, and then we'll take a look at the reason I call it heresy is because I believe that Christian nationalism, this alignment of state and church faith power, is heretical. That is, it is contrary to the central foundations and beliefs of the Christian faith. Okay? See you next
All right, so can you close us in prayer? Thank you.
Loving and faithful God, we give you thanks for those throughout the history of your people who were faithful to your word and the teaching of our Lord Jesus and stood against the use of power and violence and control. Help us in our own day to be witnesses as salt and light, to speak where we need to speak, to act in ways that demonstrate that we are salt and light, that your Spirit moves in us and produces the fruits of love and joy and self-control and peace and gentleness. Thank you that you have given us your Spirit to empower us to be your people. In Jesus' name, amen.
Repeat that question.